On this day, 232 years ago, Thomas Jefferson was revising the Declaration of Independence to present it to the Continental Congress on June 28th. Meanwhile, the Pennsylvania Journal reported on this day the discovery of a plot to kidnap George Washington and hand him over to the British. Now, those may seem like old stories about dead white men these days, but those men were young when they made a revolution. And today, you are the young revolutionaries of the 21st century, and you may see it all. There are people sitting in this room today who are going to see the 22nd century, and there are people in this room today who are very jealous about that. There are incredible things happening in technology and medicine and science that are going to change human life, and you have the opportunity to see it. And what that means is that you have all the advantages of youth right now as you launch your commitment to freedom. Energy, enthusiasm, radicalism, the opportunity to take a long-term perspective, not to worry about the next election or the next news cycle, but to think about the long term. At the first libertarian meeting I attended, I was a college student. I went to a libertarian meeting in downtown Nashville, Tennessee, and the first guy I met was about 40 years old, which seemed very old to me at the time, and I really couldn't believe that people that old could believe in an idea as radical as libertarianism. But then a young woman came up. She was maybe in her 20s, and she looked a bit like a hippie chick, and that seemed a little more like what I was expecting. But her first question was, "Have you seen my parents?" And I discovered that her parents, who were then in their 50s, which seemed incredibly old to me at the time, were really the leaders of the libertarian movement in Tennessee. And I think my understanding of the tradition of liberty and limited government changed at that time. The father that she had been looking for was a lawyer in Tennessee, and as I got to know him over the next few years, I remember him telling me a story about how he'd been the Republican candidate for a judgeship in Tennessee, and he also told me how he had been the lawyer who defended the right of a theater owner to show Deep Throat in Nashville, Tennessee. Deep Throat, some of you may know, was a famous pornographic movie in the 1970s. And he told me how he got up and he made the opening argument about why the city should allow Deep Throat to be shown in Nashville, Tennessee. And then he said the lights came down and I walked out of the room because I don't watch movies like that. And 90 minutes later, the lights came up, and he walked back in, and he turned to the jury and said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to my knowledge, you are the only 12 people in Nashville who have been required to watch this movie." And the jury found that a compelling argument. Nobody else was going to be forced to watch it, so they allowed the movie to be shown in Nashville. And that was one of my introductions to people who fight for freedom. I want to tell you one other story about sort of age and libertarians. Friedrich Hayek was born in 1899, and many years later, he actually, I think, may have been at an IHS summer program with some young people there out in California. And he said, "When I was a young man, only the very old men still believed in the free market system. When I was in my middle ages, I myself and nobody else believed in it. And now I have the pleasure of having lived long enough to see that the young people again believe in it. And that is a very important change." And the young people who so impressed Hayek are now 60 years old. And so another generation has come along. The good news is those young men and women who met Hayek 30, 35 years ago have not had to go through a period of thinking nobody else holds these ideas. That's the difference from the era that Hayek grew up in. So let me start my argument here with a proposition. Libertarianism is the application of science and reason to the study of politics and public policy. Now that's a very strong claim, so let me try to back it up. Ever since the Enlightenment, 2 or 3 centuries ago, we don't believe in magic anymore, right? We know that there are laws that govern the universe and that things happen for a reason. That's what has caused the explosion in knowledge and technology and living standards over the past couple of centuries. But Enlightenment values have not fully permeated our society. There are still some people who do believe in magic. They think that words have magical powers, that if you declare something to be true, it will be true. And who are these people? Well, unfortunately, they're not all wizards in movies. They don't all live at Hogwarts. A lot of them are governors and senators and presidents. And many of them believe that to write and vote for a bill called Social Security is to actually give people Social Security. They think that just writing a law can eliminate racism or guarantee housing or give children a family. And sadly, too many people believe the government has these magical powers. Movies like Dave tell us that if the president weren't a bad man, he'd get everybody a job. The most widely circulated magazine in America, Parade, told us what teenagers wanted from a new president. Help save our planet, they implored. Everybody, no matter how much money they have, should be able to go to college. The government could help us all. They think the president is a combination of Mother Teresa, Superman, and Santa Claus. And what we need is a president who knows that he's King Canute, who knows that he can't stop the tide, and he can't eliminate racism, and he can't fix all the problems in the world. But we don't get many people running for president who understand that. Libertarians know that reality matters. We try to discover the rules that govern the world and rules that will enable us all to live together and enjoy those wonderful rights in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to achieve those goals, we need rules like private property, free markets, and tolerance. In fact, you know that bestseller from a few years ago, All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten? You could say that you learn the essence of libertarianism, which is also the essence of civilization, in kindergarten. Don't hit other people, don't take their stuff, and keep your promises. That's all you really need to create a good society. Don't hit other people, don't take their stuff, and keep your promises. And everybody does that in their real life. It's only when they turn to government that they get confused. And they forget that a lot of the laws that people propose involve hitting other people, making them live the way you want them to live, not the way they would choose to live, or taking their stuff, taking their property through taxation, through eminent domain, through regulation, or making people not keep their promises by violating their contracts, or making promises like there will be Social Security for everybody when we all know there's no money there to back it up. So, if that's the goal that we're looking for, a society that abides by those rules, how are we doing? Well, back in the 1980s, before he was appointed to the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas spoke at the Cato Institute, and at that meeting he read from Cato's standard description of itself the line, "Since the American Revolution, civil and economic liberties have been eroded." And he looked out at a pretty much all-white audience, and he said, "It didn't really seem that way to black Americans." And we were chastened, and we changed that line. But it's still a common theme among libertarians. We're losing our freedoms year after year. We quote Thomas Jefferson, "The natural progress of things is for liberty to yield and government to gain ground." We read books with titles like Freedom in Chains, Lost Rights, and The Road to Serfdom. And it's easy to see why. Government spending is up. We face new regulations on hiring, firing, accounting, smoking, eating, drinking, and more. Businesses, activists, and politicians use legislation and litigation to steal the property of pharmaceutical firms, software companies, computer networks, and other creators. Leaders of both parties rush to expand subsidies and entitlements. We've been saddled with new restrictions on civil liberties since September 11, 2001. And our country is mired in an unnecessary war. A friend of freedom could get discouraged. But is it true? Are we less free? Are we on the road to serfdom? Are we less free than when? I like to think back to 1977 when the Cato Institute was founded. That was an era of Jimmy Carter, Tip O'Neill, energy czars, gas lines, raging inflation, ABC, NBC, CBS, Mao Zedong, the Soviet Union, apartheid. That was a different era. And reflecting on your ages, I realized I'd better pause to tell you something about what that world was like. For the first 35 years of my life, one of the basic facts about the world was that it was divided half free, half slave. Behind the Iron Curtain that descended from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, the Communist Party ruled with an iron fist. People lived from cradle to grave without any of the freedoms that we take for granted. No freedom of speech or of religion, no freedom to start a business or choose a job, no elections, no property rights, no judges, no human dignity. And as one scholar who fled China said, no freedom of silence either. Residents of a communist state are required to make positive statements of belief and loyalty. And to maintain power in such a system, the communist despots used propaganda, repression, terror, an archipelago of prison camps, and in the final analysis, the murder of some 100 million people. If you don't know that history, go look it up. But let's go back to 1977. Since that time, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan have revived the ideas of free markets and limited government. The Soviet Empire has fallen. We've learned a little bit about inflation and energy price controls. New media have arisen to challenge the establishment media, to the point that the liberal establishment media are now trying to convince their millions of readers and viewers that conservatives dominate the media. Well, we're certainly not at that point, but at least there's competition now. And as for China, China is a country of raging capitalism and political and legal protests. It's not a developed capitalist economy yet, but it has changed dramatically from the communist country that I grew up knowing about. If you look at the long term, from a past that includes despotism, feudalism, absolutism, fascism, and communism, we're clearly better off. Now, when we look at a more recent comparison, contrasting 2008 with 1776 or 1910 or 1950 or whatever, the story is less clear. We suffer under a lot of regulations and restrictions that our ancestors didn't face. But in 1776, black Americans were held in chattel slavery, and married women had no legal existence except as agents of their husbands. In 1910 and even 1950, blacks still suffered under the limits of Jim Crow, and we all faced confiscatory tax rates throughout the post-war period. Let's think back again to 1977. Not only did we have 70% tax rates, we had strict regulations on airlines and trucking. It was often illegal for a trucking company to take tomatoes to the city and ketchup back to a rural area. We had monopoly phone company and strict regulations on interest and investing, sodomy laws in most states, and, at least briefly, general wage and price controls. One of the problems with discussing whether Americans are more or less free is some confusion over the meaning of freedom. There are three things that at least feel like freedom: wealth, which gives us options; openness, which also gives people more options; and actual political liberty. First, let's talk about the effects of widespread wealth. Air travel is so cheap today that young Cato staff members fly off to Iceland to a rock concert. This would have been unbelievable to me and impossible to my father. But today, wealth is so widespread in the sense that things are so cheap that people can do that. And that feels like a kind of freedom, a choice that wasn't available to me. Wealth allows us to choose where to live. It gives us more freedom to choose careers or to opt out of the career rat race and still have a decent standard of living. We are less constrained by the necessity of eking out a living. Wealth gives us cars, computers, iPods, cell phones, knowledge beyond belief organized and accessible at google.com, and other really cool stuff. It gives us far more options for how to spend our leisure time. Indeed, a downside of affluence may be that it gives us so many options that we feel overstressed, conscious of all the interesting things we don't have time to do. Wealth is not liberty. For one thing, liberty involves responsibility, not just choices. But having ever more abundant resources feels a lot like freedom. Second, we live in a more open society. Liberalism has always campaigned for a society of merit, not status. And that meant, in the first place, the dismantling of the privileges of monarchy and aristocracy. Over the centuries, it has also meant extending liberty and equality to other races and to creeds and to women, to Jews, to gays and lesbians. Sometimes that involves dismantling actual legal barriers, and sometimes it means only a falling away of social prejudices and codes. Even if we're seeing mostly the decline of social restrictions, it's hard to tell blacks, women, Jews, and gays that they're less free in modern America than they were at some earlier point. Finally, let's look at actual political and economic liberty. It's easy to point to the ways that government has grown and liberty has yielded, and that's what causes lots of libertarians to deplore the road to serfdom and our lost rights. But that doesn't tell the whole story. In so many ways, we are freer today than we were at various points in the past. Depending on just when you think was the golden age of liberty, I could counter by reminding you of Oriental despotism, slavery, the Dark Ages, absolute monarchy, class privilege, and so on. In the 20th century, fascism, communism, and National Socialism. And even in our own country, in my own lifetime, as I find myself explaining to my younger colleagues, yes, in our own country, in my own lifetime, we lived with military conscription. I can tell you, when I was 22 years old, the most important thing in my life was worrying about being drafted into the Army and sent to Vietnam. Not having that weighing on you is a very great advantage. Military conscription, 90% income tax rates, wage and price controls, restricted entry to transportation and communications, indecency laws, and Jim Crow. All of that in the past 50 years or so. So I think that on balance, Americans today are more free than any people in history. And certainly when you combine liberty, wealth, and social openness, we have more choices and options than any people have ever had. We should take a moment to reflect on our history and celebrate what we've achieved after centuries and millennia of hard work and political struggle. But only a moment, because the struggle for freedom is never over. People who value freedom will always have to defend it from those who claim the right to wield power over others. I went to a lunch recently with Bob Novak, the columnist and television personality. He had a new book out, a memoir, and he said that when he's invited to give a commencement address, what he tells the students is, always love your country but never trust your government. Well, that's pretty good advice for citizens in a free society, because foreign and domestic, right and left, there are still plenty of people seeking to take our liberty, to force us into collective schemes, to promise us security or handouts in return for our freedom, or to impose their agendas on the rest of us. Some people voted for President Bush because he campaigned across this country telling voters, my opponent trusts government, I trust you. And what did they get? Federal spending up $1 trillion in the Bush administration. President Bush is the first president to send a budget to Congress proposing to spend $2 trillion. He's also the first president to send a budget to Congress proposing to spend $3 trillion. Education has been further federalized in the No Child Left Behind Act. Bush pulled out all the stops to get Republicans in Congress to create the biggest new entitlement program, prescription drug payments under Medicare, in 40 years. He pushed an energy bill that my colleague Jerry Taylor described as a smorgasbord of handouts and subsidies for every energy lobby in Washington. The Bible tells us that not a sparrow falls, but that God knows about it. Congressional Republicans seem to have decided that the federal government should operate on the same principle. Nothing should happen in America without Congress getting involved. Republicans used to accuse Democrats of setting up a nanny state, one that would regulate every nook and cranny of our lives. They took control of Congress in 1994 by declaring that Democrats had given us government that is too big, too intrusive, and too easy with the public's money. After 12 years in power, however, the Republicans saw the Democrats' intrusiveness and raised them. They, too, used the powers of the federal government to lavish money on favored constituents, summoned us before congressional hearings to explain ourselves, and intruded into our most local and personal decisions. The Bush administration went to court to block state initiatives on medical marijuana in California and assisted suicide in Oregon. President Bush and conservatives are backing a constitutional amendment to impose one uniform marriage law on what conservatives used to call the sovereign states. The Bush administration is pushing secret subpoenas, secret searches, secret arrests, and secret trials. American citizens are being held without access to a lawyer and without access to an impartial civilian judge. The great writ of habeas corpus is denied. And perhaps most outrageously, they want to turn our American republic into an empire. We have American troops today in 135 countries. They tell us we're going to have troops and military bases in Iraq for as long as we've had them in Korea. Intellectuals close to the Bush administration write articles titled "The Case for American Empire." And so, not surprisingly, after 12 years of this, the voters turned out the Republicans and put the Democrats in charge. And as Dr. Phil would say, how's that working out for you? Within 2 months of the Democratic takeover, the Democrats were charging big bucks to lobbyists to meet Nancy Pelosi and the chairman of the congressional committees that write the tax laws and the spending bills and the regulations, including some of Jack Abramoff's favorite clients. After a year, they'd held hearings and press conferences and all-night slumber parties. But the war goes on, the spending goes on. We're up to 32,000 earmarks in the latest spending bills. Congress has not limited the president's claim of sweeping powers of detention and surveillance. The Democrats should get the Who to sing at their next convention, "Meet the new boss, same as the old boss." And of course, when I say boss, that's like a casting call for Hillary Clinton. We dodged a bullet there. For more than 15 years now, Hillary has been the walking incarnation of big government. She calls herself a government junkie. She thinks the federal government should redefine who we are as human beings in the postmodern age. She just might be the scariest collectivist this side of Al Gore. And some people who are scared of Hillary Clinton are a lot more enthusiastic about Barack Obama. Even some conservatives see Obama as a candidate of change who could transcend old fights and old limits, and at least he wouldn't mean another round of Bill and Hillary. And in his speeches, Obama can be very eloquent. His oratory soars. If you watched his speech after the South Carolina primary, he gave a ringing speech on national television that had his admirers swooning. And it's hard not to respond to him when he says that his supporters are young and old, rich and poor, they are black and white, Latino and Asian, and they join us in saying that we are tired of business as usual in Washington, we are hungry for change, and we are ready to believe again. Real leadership is about candor and judgment and the ability to rally Americans from all walks of life around a common purpose, a higher purpose. But listen carefully. He denounces bitter partisanship that is preventing the federal government from coming together to make college affordable and energy cleaner, give us universal and affordable health care, higher teacher pay, more Medicaid, tax hikes, protectionist measures, subsidies for homeowners, more money for senior citizens. He even promised that his administration would give Americans higher wages. What he's really promising is that he will transcend partisanship, move beyond polarization, put together a coalition to overcome America's resistance to big government. And compared to that, John McCain may look pretty good, but not that good. He's a pretty good fiscal conservative and a consistent free trader, even though he said the other day that he doesn't know much about economics, and he's been working to prove that. But as Mike Tanner wrote the other day, John McCain makes Dr. Strangelove look like a peacenik. He's talked about leaving troops in Iraq for 100 years and seems hell-bent on war with Iran. His childhood hero was Napoleon, and his adult role model is Teddy Roosevelt, the father of imperialism, executive power, and the regulatory state. It's no wonder that he's the favorite choice of the national greatness conservatives. He wants to make a federal issue out of every pet peeve, from steroids in baseball to airline service quality. He declares that the companies that make life-saving drugs are our enemy. He sneers at Mitt Romney's business experience and says, "I know how to lead for patriotism, not for profit." He wants national service programs in which participants not only wear uniforms and work in teams, but actually live together in barracks on former military bases and are deployed to service projects far from their home base and gather together for daily calisthenics, often in highly public places, such as in front of City Hall. Daily calisthenics together in uniform in front of City Hall. That is not a vision of America. That's some other country he's thinking of. He's traveled around the world a lot. I'm not sure which country he's thinking of, but it isn't this country. And my pet peeve about him is that he and his supporters keep saying that he ought to be Commander-in-Chief of the United States. If you look in the Constitution, there is no job Commander-in-Chief of the United States. There is the job of President of the United States, the person who presides over the executive branch, and one of his jobs is to be Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States. But there is no Commander-in-Chief of the free people of the United States, and I think it's very revealing that a candidate for president could use language like that. So as I said earlier, a friend of freedom could get depressed thinking about all of this. But if you need an antidote to depression, go to the video store, go to Netflix, and rent the movie Amazing Grace. It is a wonderful British-made movie with fine actors telling the story of William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament in the early 19th century, who spent 50 years fighting for freedom. And he was fighting slavery. It took him 50 years to persuade the people of England that they shouldn't hold people in chains. So when we think about that, maybe we realize that it might take us a while to persuade people that it was a bad idea to turn retirement over to the federal government, a bad idea to turn education over to the people who run the Department of Motor Vehicles, a bad idea to let the government decide what we can smoke or drink. If it took 50 years to fight slavery, we should remember that it might take us some time too. Or just remember a small band of farmers and lawyers and merchants on a colonial frontier 3,000 miles from the civilized world who took on the greatest power in the world in the defense of their rights. More than 200 years ago, Thomas Jefferson and the other signers of the Declaration of Independence committed themselves to the cause of American liberty with these words, "And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." And they weren't kidding. 12 signers had their homes ransacked and burned by the British. 9 more died from wounds or hardships of the Revolutionary War. None, however, lost their sacred honor. And so if I have a piece of advice for you today, it would be, don't be afraid to speak up for your beliefs. If you believe in freedom, don't be afraid to let people know about that. It can be scary to disagree. We think of Rosa Parks, who decided one day, I'm tired and I'm not moving to the back of the bus. And she suffered. Eventually, she became a heroine of the civil rights movement, but she was risking something when she did that. We think of James Meredith, the first black man who tried to attend the University of Mississippi, where his family paid taxes. And rocks were thrown at him. He was spat upon. Governors stood in the door to stop him. I think of Frank Kameny, a guy who was fired from the federal government 55 years ago because he was a homosexual. They didn't tolerate that in the federal government employment at the time. And he started, all by himself, petitioning for the rights of gay people. He walked alone with a sign in front of the White House. He organized tiny groups of people who were afraid to put their own names on the flyers and the articles that they wrote. And over the years, he achieved what he set out to do, as did Rosa Parks and James Meredith. I think of a story back in 1975. OSHA inspectors came to Bill Barlow's little electrical and plumbing installation business located in Pocatello, Idaho. The inspectors wanted to come in and look around. Bill Barlow asked if they had a search warrant, and they didn't, so he wouldn't let them in. The Secretary of Labor went and got a court order requiring him to let OSHA inspectors in, not on any charges, but just because they wanted to look around and see if there might be anything wrong. But he still refused and countersued, and the Federal Court of Appeals upheld him, and then so did the Supreme Court. And Bill Barlow went down in history also as a hero of liberty, though one not as celebrated as Rosa Parks and James Meredith. But you don't have to do things like that. Just speak up when somebody says there ought to be a law or the government should help those people. Ask them who would be helped, who would be hurt. Are you sure that what you're proposing would be an improvement? There's no magic bullet. There's never been a golden age of liberty, and there never will be. There will always be people who want to live their lives in peace, and there will always be people who want to exploit them or impose their own ideas on others. There will always be a conflict between liberty and power. And when we think of doing something about it, we have it easier than some. On a Saturday morning in the summer of 2000, 8 young people met in a shabby apartment near Beijing University and started a study group to debate the need for political reform in China. Some were students, others were recent graduates, not one was over 30. One of them was Yang Zi Li, a computer whiz who was inspired by reading Václav Havel and F.A. Hayek. He set up a website, Yang Zi's Home of Ideas, where he posted forceful essays condemning communism and arguing for democratic reform. I am a liberal, he wrote, and what I care about are human rights, freedom, and democracy. You don't have to do all this, his wife told him. With your education, you could have a better future. You should think of your parents, your family, our economic situation. But Yang brushed aside the complaint. His wife said he told me that someone had to stand up and work for social progress, and he had decided to stand up. And on March 13th, 2001, less than a year after this study group started, state security agents detained 5 study group members, including the young Hayek fan Yang Zi Li. They have been in a Chinese jail for more than 7 years now. There's another story like this that touches us at the Cato Institute even more closely. A young man in Egypt named Karim Amir. He went to a Cato seminar in Cairo, Egypt. He was 21 years old. He was a blogger. He went to a seminar for liberal bloggers to network, to find out how they could affect change. And as he explains it, he came from a repressive Islamist family. He finally decided that he did not want to live in a cave with no music, internet, or television. He said, I started blogging because it was a way of expressing my disapproval of many issues in society, specifically the ill treatment of women in the Muslim world. He lived in Alexandria, and he observed Muslim riots against a Christian church outside his window. And he told an interviewer, what I witnessed during these riots is what inspired me to write an article, the truth as I saw it, and nothing else. So he started blogging. And then, as he told the interviewer, that freedom didn't last long. I launched my blog in August 2005, and I was arrested 2 months later on October 26, 2005. He was taken to state security. He was blindfolded. He said, I sat silent on a chair for hours, not aware that there was someone in the room watching me. Suddenly, a man approached me. He said, I want you to tell me everything, or I will gradually torture you like there is no tomorrow. On February 22, 2007, Karim was sentenced to 4 years in prison. 3 years for contempt of religion, and 1 year for defaming the president of Egypt. His father has called for him to be executed for his criticisms of Islam, and he remains in jail today. He was able to talk to an interviewer. That's how we know this story. If you'd like to help Karim, there is a website, freekarim.org. If you'd like to help the Chinese students, there's a website, newyouth4.org. Can't be sure anything you can do will help, but it can't hurt. We have it easier. No one will put us in jail for speaking out. All we have to do is write letters to our public officials and letters to the editor and speak out at public meetings or speak up against subsidies at a trade association, give a book to a friend, give money to a candidate, join a group working for tax cuts or gay marriage or against the war or to free political prisoners, or create a libertarian student group on your campus or nationwide. But we do have to do that because freedom isn't free. As we read the newspapers and watch the television and despair about the corruption and collectivism in Washington and the far worse tyrannies in other lands, let us remember that the human spirit flourishes in freedom. Thomas Jefferson's revolution did succeed. William Wilberforce and Frederick Douglass did end slavery. The Soviet Union did dissolve. And if we commit ourselves to that legacy, we can make the 21st century the freest century yet. Thank you very much. I would be glad to take questions relating to this speech or to any other topic relating to liberty and tyranny and limited government. And Scott will bring a microphone around to anybody who has a question. Yes. Stand up, please.
Hi, my name is Libby Jacobson, and I guess my question is, and I'm sure libertarians get asked this a lot, but as far as effecting change through our political system, which is a two-party system, libertarian candidates generally don't get too much attention or a large percentage of the vote. Do you have any suggestions for how we could, I guess, use the system against itself?
Well, I think there are lots of suggestions. You know, there is an old anarchist slogan, if voting could change the system, it would be against the law. And there's something to that. The Libertarian Party doesn't get very many votes. It's a very difficult environment for third parties in America. There are a lot of reasons for that. I was talking to a reporter today. People think the two-party system is in the Constitution. People think you're crazy if you're in a third party. It's very difficult to get on the ballot. You have to spend all your money just getting on the ballot. Then it's difficult to raise money because of the campaign finance laws. It's difficult to get media attention. So yes, it is difficult. Now, there are libertarians occasionally who run in the Republican or the Democratic Party. There are libertarians who run as independents. There are certainly in a number of races candidates who are better from a libertarian point of view than other candidates, and so you may want to work for one of them even though they're not necessarily libertarians. There are also lots of things you can do to affect the political process that don't involve simply voting or working for a candidate. As I mentioned, you can get involved in single-issue groups. Certainly in the 22 states where there is the initiative process, you can join a group and put a tax cut initiative on the ballot, or a term limits initiative, or a school choice initiative, or a medical marijuana initiative, or a gay marriage or civil unions initiative. There are town meetings up in New England where people have passed resolutions against the war. Now, obviously, if a town advises the federal government to get out of the war, that doesn't have a lot of impact, but it is something people can do. So there are lots of ways to work. You can also go online. You know, we used to say what we needed is envelope stuffers and precinct walkers. And that's what people were supposed to do if they got involved in politics. These days, you can stuff a lot of envelopes in the privacy of your own home on your email account. You've heard of the organization MoveOn.org. MoveOn started because one couple got fed up with the Clinton impeachment process, and they sent an email to their friends saying, "Can't we just censure him and move on?" And the friends found that interesting, and they sent it to more people who sent it to more people, and this organization arose out of that. So everybody here is capable of accidentally having an idea that turns into something important, or of actually thinking of an entrepreneurial idea. So there are many ways to change our society that don't involve simply working for candidates. But I'm not advising you not to work for libertarian candidates. I remember what Eugene Debs, the old socialist candidate, used to say: it's better to vote for what you want and not get it than to vote for what you don't want and get it. Another question? Back there?
You talked a lot about how lots of people around the world today still live under oppressive states, and in the past as well. But you also talked about how libertarianism is opposed to imperialism. And I'm wondering if you could talk about, one, how is there a way, I mean, you mentioned some websites, but is there a way to affect change in those oppressive countries without engaging in imperialistic sort of actions? And also, how do you look at things like the Cold War, which did affect change in a country, but it also probably hurt a lot of people at the time, but, you know, in the long run, is, you know, how do you weigh those things? Like, it might be an imperialist, it might have involved several imperialist actions, but would the Soviet Union still be standing if we hadn't engaged in those imperialist actions?
Well, that's a big question. It's at least two big questions, I think. One is, what can we do for oppressed people in other countries? And another one is American foreign policy generally, I think. And there certainly are people who believe in liberty, limited government, and free markets, who also think it's the role of the federal government, the United States government, to extend those values to other countries. I think if you look at the history of American foreign policy, it is not at all clear that when American troops are sent overseas, their primary purpose or effect is to extend freedom. But it's at least theoretically possible that could be the reason we would want to do it. Sometimes that's a retroactive explanation. For instance, we were told back in 2002 that the reason we needed to send troops to Iraq was because there were weapons of mass destruction there that might be used against us. When it was discovered that there were no weapons of mass destruction, we then sort of evolved a retroactive justification, which was that we were overthrowing a dictator, liberating the women of Iraq, and bringing freedom and democracy there. That's not working out so well. And the fact that it's not working out so well is something we need to remember. Over the course of American history, we can point to a couple of cases where, gee, it looks like American intervention did leave behind something better than had gone before. But we can also point to a lot of examples where that's not been the case, where a lot of Americans have died, where a lot of other people have died. And so it seems to me governments are armed and dangerous, and it's generally a good idea if you keep them separate. And that does mean that there will be oppression. There is some level of oppression in virtually every country in the world. When I hear people say, well, I think that, it was appropriate to invade Iraq because Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator, I want to ask them, well, there's a dozen other brutal dictators in the Arab world, and there's 50 of them in Africa, and there are some in Asia as well. Should we invade all of them? I think that is what a book author once called perpetual war for perpetual peace. We would be constantly at war. There are things I think we can do. I think groups like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch do shine a light on political prisoners in other countries, and they have some effect. Not as much effect as we would like, but they have some. The media in our world today in particular, I think, play an important role in making countries want to be part of the civilized world. Certainly there are things short of war, like economic sanctions and diplomatic remonstrances and so on, that may be an appropriate tool for encouraging the development of better governance in a lot of countries. There are individuals who go there to expose, to undermine governments. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do, but we have to remember that just as we as libertarians say, not every problem in the United States is appropriate to be solved by the federal government, I think it's also true that not every problem around the world is appropriate to be solved by the American government, even if the easiest thing is to say there ought to be a law and there ought to be an American invasion. That's the easiest solution to this problem, but I think it's often the wrong solution.
Hi there. Okay. Yeah. My name is Price Rayner. I was wondering, and maybe it's fitting that the Libertarian Party is like this because we do believe in decentralization, but it seems like there are a lot of different factions in the movement of libertarianism. There's kind of the Ron Paul group, there's groups like Cato, and I was wondering if there's any, movement towards uniting a lot of different, factions within the libertarian movement, or even if that's necessary.
Well, the fact is that people have different interests and different understandings, and if you read a history of the American left, you're going to find lots of factional fights on the American left, and if you read the history of the American right, you're going to find lots of factions. M. Stanton Evans, a leading conservative, has talked about how, the first thing we do when we form a new organization is purge somebody. Well, that's just sort of human nature. So I don't think it's ever going to be the case that you're going to organize all libertarians into a centralized, uniform group that will take orders and follow somebody. It's any organization or person has to be able to do that. That's part of being an effective political leader, is being able to unite enough people behind you. To some extent, of course, being perceived as a potential winner helps. Ronald Reagan was able to unite a lot of people behind him, partly because people thought he could win. Ron Paul was never a prospect to win, and therefore it was sort of a different question. Not, would I prefer Ron Paul to these other candidates to be president, but for a lot of people the question was, do I think Ron Paul is a good representative of the libertarian philosophy? And there were people who thought he was and people who thought he was not. You mentioned a variety of groups, some of which are think tanks and don't get involved in politics. Some are magazines and they comment, but they're not trying to lead anybody. Some are political leaders. Also, you're thinking of a small group of libertarians, but David Kirby and I did some research a couple of years ago. I should say David Kirby did all the research and I wrote it up. But what we found was that if you look at a lot of bodies of polling data, you can find maybe 15% of the American people who hold generally libertarian views and in a way that distinguishes them from being liberal or conservative. And yet the Libertarian Party only gets half of 1%. So we really should be thinking about not just the Libertarian Party or even the libertarian movement, but a broader group of Americans who basically believe in less government, government that stays out of your personal life and your economic life, that sort of thing. And there are lots of inconsistencies there. When people ask me how many libertarians there are, I say, well, there's a whole lot of different answers. There might be 100,000 people who subscribe to a libertarian magazine or give money to a libertarian think tank or something like that. There's about 500,000 who typically vote for a libertarian presidential candidate. There's maybe a couple of million in a typical election who vote for some libertarian candidate, but not the presidential candidate. According to our survey, there's 15%, which is, maybe 20, 25 million, who hold broadly libertarian views. But we also did a poll of our own at election time, 2006. We polled people who said they had voted in the election that had just happened, and we asked them, would you describe yourself as fiscally conservative and socially liberal? We thought that was a broad definition of libertarianism, but one that says, I'm not quite a conservative and I'm not quite a liberal. So we said, would you describe yourself as fiscally conservative and socially liberal? 59% said yes. A majority of the respondents, in effect, said, I'm not exactly a conservative, I'm not exactly a liberal. And then we asked half the sample a tougher question, which was, would you describe yourself as fiscally conservative and socially liberal, also known as libertarian? So now you're kind of slapping people in the face. You've got to call yourself a libertarian. 44% still said yes. So 44% of the American people were willing to say, I guess you could call me a libertarian if you define it that way. So that suggests to me that there is some upside potential and there is room for a political entrepreneur, or more than one, to find a way to bring these people together. And that could be a political candidate. It could be a political organizer. It could be an organization like MoveOn.org or the Conservative Caucus or whatever. Could be a magazine, could be a think tank, but obviously most people are not going to want to become either employees or financial supporters of a think tank. So magazines, political candidates, and mass membership organizations seem like better bets. So there's plenty of entrepreneurial opportunities there, and if you ask me, there's a market that is not being adequately exploited.
Hi, Johnny Slimrod. In your career as an advocate for limited government, have you found it more effective to argue from a moral standpoint, that is to say, coercion on the behalf of the state is immoral, or from a practical standpoint, that free markets bring the most wealth, opportunity, innovation?
Well, I can't seem to convince my own assistant on the moral point, so maybe I'd better stick to the utilitarian point. I think you do both, at least if you believe both. And I think even people who say they don't believe in natural rights do believe in something very similar to natural rights. When you say to them, well, is it okay for the government just to do this to this group of people? They know that's wrong. I saw an article somewhere where somebody said, what good have natural rights ever actually done anybody? And I think one answer is they persuaded a lot of white people to work in the abolitionist movement, because it was wrong. They persuaded a lot of Europeans to save Jews from the Holocaust because they knew it was wrong. So yes, they've had some very practical impacts. However, I think I find in most arguments, you're going to find utilitarian, consequentialist arguments easier to discuss and acceptable and appealing to a broader range of people. So the real reason I am for liberty is because I hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that it seems to me it is self-evidently wrong to use force to take things from people or to force them to act in ways they wouldn't otherwise do. But apparently not everybody finds it self-evidently wrong to hit other people and take their stuff, at least when we talk about politics. And so I do want to talk about practical things. I want to discuss the fact that rent control sounds like a great idea. Let's not make rents go any higher than this. But you know what happens when you impose rent control? People don't build apartments anymore. People take apartments and convert them to condos, and you end up with less housing. So that's not what you were trying to achieve, right? And I think if we do a good job, we ought to be able to explain to an awful lot of people that the goal you're trying to achieve can't be achieved by the methods you're talking about. And there's not a firm distinction between the moral and the practical argument there. If it were not the case that human beings prosper and flourish under freedom, then it probably wouldn't make any sense to say it was the moral thing for human beings. Nobody says that honeybees should be free and practice constitutional government. That's not in their nature. I think it's in the nature of human beings to be free, that we flourish in a condition of freedom, that we ought to be able to make our own choices. But one of the ways we know that's true is that we can see the results of freedom as a practical matter. And if what we saw was that Hong Kong, with no rules and regulations, just a distant colonial master that doesn't really care, is desperately poor, whereas centrally organized China, boy, they're leading the way on technology and prosperity and living standards, well, then we would have to wonder if our theories about human nature were right. In fact, we know from experience. In fact, one of the problems with the fall of communism is we have fewer good illustrations to point out. You know, I mean, you really could say to people, look at Hong Kong and look at China. Look at East and West Germany. I mean, East and West Germany. Here are two groups of people who have the same ethnicity, the same history for 1,000 years, and then you put a wall down the middle of them, and what do you get? 40 years later, in East Germany, they've produced the Trabant, a little car that chokes along for 50 feet until it dies. And in West Germany, they've created Volkswagen, Mercedes-Benz, Audi. That's the difference. But we don't have East and West Germany anymore. We don't really have communist China anymore. It's harder to find those specific examples, and I sometimes think we should keep some of them around just for teaching purposes. When I finally got to cross the Berlin Wall, it had lost its pizzazz. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody frisked me when I got to the other side, and I sort of feel like we should keep communism around to show people. And I think in a way that makes our argument harder than it used to be, because it was fairly easy after the first decade or so to point out to people that central planning as practiced in Russia or China or places like that was a disaster, and unplanning as practiced generally in the West, but especially in the United States and Hong Kong, was clearly better. When the argument is no longer, let's have complete socialism or let's have American-style freedom, but the argument is more like let's have American-style markets or French-style markets, well, it's much harder to make an empirical case there. France is certainly a successful country. They have great wine, great cheese, and a wonderful culture. Not exactly a lot of new technology coming out of France, but they're rich enough they can buy ours, and so they're doing okay. So when you try to compare the United States or Hong Kong to Sweden or France, it's a much closer issue, a much more difficult case to make. And in a way, that's a challenge for us. We had pretty well mastered the case against socialism, and then socialism collapsed. Yes?
Yeah. You've used the endowed by creator quote tonight and other times. Where do you see religion as fitting in within the libertarian movement?
Well, I see it in the Declaration of Independence. That's what I'm quoting. Other than that, I think the relationship, libertarianism is a political philosophy. Communitarians, I don't know whether you've heard of the communitarians. I assume there are some people on campus who talk about communitarians. The favorite quotation, the favorite statement of the communitarians is, they puff themselves up, they get up and they say, the language of rights is morally incomplete. Well, no kidding. Nobody ever said it was morally complete. The language of rights is don't hit other people and don't take their stuff. But that's a pretty minimal morality. That doesn't tell you very much about how to deal with your parents, your teachers, your girlfriend. All it tells you is don't hit people and steal from them. But it doesn't tell you very much about how to live a moral life. It certainly doesn't tell you whether to worship God or not. So in that sense, libertarianism is a political philosophy. It is not a complete philosophy of life. It is, in my view, a political philosophy that is compatible with a lot of different moral and religious philosophies. You can absolutely be, and since I couldn't possibly hold all of these other views, I have to be cautious in saying this, but in my view, you can be a Christian libertarian, you can be a Jewish libertarian, you can be a Muslim libertarian, you can be an objectivist libertarian. You can hold a lot of moral views and still be a libertarian. And in some ways, even if you don't think you really ought to be a libertarian, libertarianism should be your second choice. Because, you know, you might be a traditionalist Catholic and you say, I want the church's laws to be the laws of the state. However, if I don't have the political power to achieve that, then I would like libertarianism to be the laws of the state so that nobody else can impose their Satan-worshiping doctrines on me through the force of government. And similarly, you know, if you're a Muslim, you might want to impose Sharia law on the whole country. But if you don't think you have the political power to achieve that, then you ought to prefer living in a libertarian society to the traditional Catholic society where they don't allow anybody to practice Islam, that sort of thing. The relationship, though, might be something different from what is inherent in libertarianism. And in that regard, one of the things I argue in Libertarianism a Primer is that people often think libertarianism is a philosophy of economic freedom. They see it tied to Mises and Hayek and Friedman, and that's absolutely true, it is. But historically, it comes more out of the struggle for religious toleration. Economics comes along much later. And a lot of times I think we believe the people who ought to be libertarians are secular people, or maybe people who don't take their religion all that seriously. They're not nuts about it. And yet historically, some of the people who fought the hardest for freedom were people who did believe devoutly in their religion. Because who would be willing to risk his life for freedom? Might be somebody who believed in eternal life, and it might be somebody who believed that the alternative is being forced to separate himself from God as he understood it on this earth. And so religious toleration really comes out of the struggles of people who are devout religious believers and who might themselves not be all that tolerant if they were in power. But not being in power, they develop the arguments for toleration. So I think you can see, going all the way back to the ancient Jews, to Jesus, to struggles in Western civilization like Thomas à Becket and Sir Thomas More, this is the way libertarianism develops. You can certainly see religious libertarians in the abolitionist battle, in the peace movement, lots of places like that. So Ayn Rand, as a sort of militant atheist, kind of gave libertarianism the image of being non-religious or even anti-religious, but it's certainly not inherently that. There are a lot of religious libertarians, there are a lot of unreligious libertarians. Hopefully, we can all get along on the political program of liberty and separation of church and state. There?
Hi, my name is Molly Crane. We've spoken about how a central tenet of libertarianism is limited government. But my question is, what guidelines can you offer for when the government should intervene? For example, we've spoken about racism in the United States. was it right for the government to legally mandate and end segregation? And additionally, if there's going to be some sort of de jure mandate on the floor, does the government have some sort of obligation to create a de facto reality in order to kind of inspire that de jure mandate to?
I'm not sure I follow that second part.
Well, I mean, like if there's laws being passed, does the government also have an obligation to try to kind of match a de facto reality to what the kind of de jure law proposes?
I'm sorry. I'm just
like busing, for example, would be an example. If you're trying to end segregation.
I'm against busing.
Okay, so I'm asking, when should the government intervene? In an example in which you want to end segregation, should the government be doing things like busing as well, if we think that ending segregation is something that's valid?
Okay. Obviously, different libertarians are going to have different answers to this question because there aren't necessarily hard and fast answers, and there are libertarians of widely varying types. My own view is that the role of government is to protect our rights to life, liberty, and property, and that's pretty much it. I believe that it is always wrong to initiate force against people to achieve your goals, not theirs. And so I think some of the things you're talking about are, given that the government is doing something bad, in what way should it stop doing it? Well, it should stop doing it. Segregation was a government policy. We should have stopped it. The fact that people may live in different neighborhoods, if that happens voluntarily, I don't think the government should do anything about that. But the fact that schools are segregated is they're government schools. I don't believe there were laws requiring that private schools be segregated, and if some states did have such laws, then they ought to have been repealed. Libertarians would not have supported them. So you're really talking about what should the government stop doing in a lot of these areas. It should stop segregating. It should stop discriminating against women. It should stop intervening to create inequalities in society. But natural inequalities, things that happen spontaneously, I think those things should be dealt with through private action. I don't think, right now they're, they've just legalized gay marriage in California. And so there are a lot of gay couples wanting to get married out there. And it turns out that a small number of wedding planners and wedding photographers don't want to photograph or plan gay weddings. It goes against their religious or moral views. I don't think the government should step in and say, you got to go plan a gay wedding. I can't really imagine why you'd want your photographs at your wedding be taken by somebody who didn't like what you were doing. I've seen enough bad wedding photos from people who were trying. But that's an example of where there are some people upset that I called this wedding planner and she said she wouldn't plan my wedding. I called this photographer and he said he wouldn't take pictures. And I think that's too bad. I think those people are acting on unfortunate moral impulses. But I think they have a right to do it. And so I don't think the government should force wedding planners to plan the weddings that they don't approve of. There may well be wedding planners who don't approve of interreligious marriages. Now, capitalism tends to erode these sort of things. If you decide to be a wedding planner and you decide to make a list of the kinds of weddings you won't plan, you will have fewer customers than people who are willing to take everybody who pays. And that's one of the ways capitalism erodes these kinds of prejudices. People decide maybe their prejudices aren't worth that much. But I don't think the government should do that. Now, there are a whole lot of other things that you could talk about. What should the government do? Well, should it build roads? Well, I think roads can be built on the free market. Should the government build schools? No, I think schools can clearly be provided on the free market. People want education. They don't necessarily want schools, and that's one of the things we get into a too static a mindset. How would the schools work in a free market? Well, maybe there wouldn't be schools. There would be education because we got to get education in order to improve society. But would there actually be schools? I don't know. Schools haven't changed in hundreds of years. Most forms of information transfer in our society have changed, so maybe we wouldn't have schools. But I don't think the government needs to interfere in them. Yes?
Hi, I'm Valerie Steinberg. So in continuing with that question, your response to the questions about segregation and should government be involved in anything like that was basically that no, because if they have chosen to be in the communities by themselves that are segregated, then the public schools will, if they're also coincidentally segregated from then the government shouldn't do anything to interfere.
I don't think that's quite right, but I'll let you finish your question.
Sorry. Maybe that's not exactly what you said, but the point is, a lot of the things that the government should stop doing now, if the answer is that the government shouldn't provide them because they could exist in the free market, like schools. My question is, how do we make up for the past wrongs of the government? So if the government previously implemented policies that enforced segregation, suddenly now segregation isn't happening anymore, and obviously, you know, black people and white people are going to be living in different neighborhoods and continuing to go to different schools. Now, how do we deal with such things to deal with government past wrongs without, I mean, it's sort of the rut of government policy that, like, once government, you know, does something that maybe they shouldn't have done, they need to try to fix it, which is why things like busing get started. So how would you respond to it?
Well, remember, when you talk about busing, you're assuming there are public schools. And I don't think there should be public schools, or at least there shouldn't be government-run schools. So my solution is get rid of the government-run schools, let people choose the schools they want to attend, let private providers provide those schools. I don't want to have the government schools, and therefore there's no reason to be busing. But I would say, even if we do still have government schools, it was wrong to bus black kids past the nearest school in order to make them go to a school farther away. And I think it's also wrong to bus white kids past the nearest school in order to go to a school farther away. Now, within the system of public schools that I don't think should exist, you can do things like public school choice and charter schools and those kinds of things to mix, but I don't think it's right to take today's kids and say, well, we're going to put you on a long bus ride because your parents went to segregated schools. Let's move past that. I also think markets shake things up very fast. It didn't take long once we allowed Jews complete access to the American economy for them to do very well. So I don't think you need the government constantly intervening. I think you end these discriminations, you end these sorts of things, and you will see people responding very fast. In fact, one of the reasons, the basic reason we had Jim Crow laws was because at the end of the Civil War, we got rid of racial restrictions, and after a couple of decades, black people were starting to do better economically than some of the white racists thought was a good idea, and that's when they started implementing Jim Crow and forced segregation. So the fight there was to keep the government from imposing segregation rules. In general, if you have to impose rules to keep people apart, it suggests that people weren't naturally staying apart. If people truly naturally didn't want to marry each other across racial lines, well, then you wouldn't need laws against interracial marriage. It's the fact that people do want to marry each other that requires those laws. There are some circumstances, perhaps, where solving the problem that was created by earlier laws may be valid, but in general, I think you just end up with more unjust laws when you try to do that. So I think it's generally a bad idea. Aaron?
Aaron Massey. You are standing behind the podium with the wisdom of experience, and you gave us some very good general advice on the advantages of youth and things that we could do. But I was wondering if you personally were out here in the audience, a college student looking at your career, what would you do with your advantages of youth, and how would you shape that career?
Oh, I'm not sure you want to ask an older person that sort of thing, because my understanding of it is necessarily conditioned on having been young in a very different world. I guess one thing I would tell you is you do have the prospect of living much longer than people have in the past. So don't feel you have to rush through college and get a job at the age of 22 and start working toward that pension. You may live a long time. Think about things you'd like to do, things you might want to do for a while. I would say don't even assume you have to go to college. I think there is an unfortunate situation that a whole lot of jobs require a college degree even though they don't really require a college degree. It's not like what you learn in college is essential to this job. It is that employers use the college degree as an indicator that you're qualified for such a job. There's not a lot you can do about that, although we do have a more entrepreneurial world in a lot of ways, and I think you can get out of it to some extent. Think long term, but don't feel you have to make all your plans right now. Think about the opportunities that are opening up. I'll tell you, over the past few years, I've gotten so many job applications from people who have a .com failure on their resume. And part of America is you get a second chance. I don't hold it against people that they have a .com failure on their resume. Oh, that's interesting, you know. Yeah, there were a lot of those. A lot of people got caught up in that. So don't assume that you can't fail. Look for what's going to be different. Look for what's new. But don't forget the fact that the market sends you signals. And if the market is telling you that old professions like nursing are paying well, then that's a signal that it's probably not going away. I don't know. That's probably not very good. I should know more about this, but I'm not young. I don't have that perspective. So you got to ask young people that. Any other questions? Didn't you have a question? Go ahead. You kept almost raising your hand.
It's related to like the previous topic.
That's all right.
Okay, Astrodarka. Well, Meredith was talking about liberty in other countries. So in my 2 years in this country, I've quickly noticed that U.S. citizens, and often only U.S. citizens, have a lot of freedom when it comes to dissent and just expressing their opinions and organizing and saying whatever they think. But you mentioned it yourself, Kareem, and the Chinese student. What is your suggestion, or what do you think about other countries? How do you spark ideas about freedom, and how do you spark those initiatives in countries where libertarianism doesn't even exist, where you don't have a U.S. Constitution and a Bill of Rights, and even if you do, people don't respect it. I mean, people actually, it's a piece of paper, and you guys actually respect it. Like, I have a Constitution too, and people don't care. So what do you do about that? I mean, we have a very big focus on American libertarianism and freedom in America, but what do you do about other countries when the environment is just not the same?
Well, to some extent, the answer is I don't do anything about them. People in those countries will have to. I mean, Americans had to make their revolution. Ukrainians changed the way things worked in their country. Lots of African countries threw off their colonial masters at various points. So the real point is people do have to find these ideas and have to change their own countries. However, we can help in some ways. One of the things the Cato Institute is doing is we've created programs in 10 languages now: Russian, Chinese, Arabic, Kurdish, Portuguese. I never remember the entire list. And these programs include websites and book translations and newspaper op-eds and seminars. And in all these ways, we are trying to get the ideas of liberty out into those countries. And it's small, obviously, at this point. The number of people who go to our Chinese website or whatever is small, but that's how ideas get started. So that is one way. I do think on specific reforms, things like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are useful. Jim Powell wrote a book a few years ago called The Triumph of Liberty, and it tells wonderful stories about people who fought for liberty over the years. And a lot of them ended up the way Kareem did, or worse. A lot of the people in this book are not just heroes, they're martyrs. And so the reality is, in countries where freedom and free speech are not respected, there are a lot of risks for people to speak out. And there's not much I can say to those people except I respect whatever choice they make. But we do have ways of spreading ideas, and we invite you to go back to your country with stacks of our books or stacks of somebody else's books, including books that aren't necessarily from the United States. One of the things we've consciously tried to do on our international websites is decenter the United States from the advance of liberalism and libertarianism in the world, to look for articles and books coming out of France or Sweden or China or the Arab world, the Muslim world, so that it becomes, that it does not get perceived as American imperialism of some sort. I do think there's a limit to how much you want America to be out there pushing these ideas. Back in the 50s, when we feared that Europe might go communist, there was a very distinguished magazine called Encounter that talked about the ideas of liberalism, and the CIA paid for it. Secretly. You can't do that anymore. CIA wouldn't get away with that for a year before they would get caught secretly subsidizing it. So American foundations could. Even better would be French and English foundations. And your point about the Constitution, in most countries, the Constitution is more like a claim of power by the government. Our Constitution is a grant of powers, not power, but powers to the federal government. And although it has not worked perfectly, it does retain that sense. In fact, I assume you all know that just today, the Supreme Court told the government it had gone too far. And I know there are countries where that doesn't happen. If you go to the Cato Institute website, there's a couple of blog items there that I like. My colleague blogged the other day about a Stephen Colbert interview about the Boumediene case. This was the holding of prisoners in Guantanamo. And as I'm sure you know much better than I do, I dimly perceive that Stephen Colbert plays a character named Stephen Colbert who is sort of a blowhard neoconservative. And so he's interviewing this constitutional scholar who says, so the court told the government it can't hold these people forever? And he said, that's right. And he says, where does the Constitution get off telling the government what it can and cannot do? Well, in most countries, that would be a good question. In our country, it actually does mean something. And the sad thing, as I blogged later, is Colbert was sort of speaking for the 4 conservative justices on the Supreme Court who had said, hey, you can't tell the president what to do. But today, Colbert could be speaking for the 4 liberal justices on the Supreme Court who said, hey, the Constitution can't tell the District of Columbia government what kind of gun control policy makes sense for their citizens. Well, yes, it can, but only 5 justices of the Supreme Court understand that, and 4 of them thought the Constitution couldn't tell the president he couldn't hold people forever without a lawyer and a trial. So our Constitution does sort of work for that. I know there are not a lot of countries where it does, and so I guess my secret advice is take our Constitution and try to get your country to pass something very close to it. But I know that it can be difficult to do that, and, well, that's right, but we are lucky. I gave a lecture to the Koch interns, not the Koch fellows, the Koch interns, the other day on the history of the libertarian movement. And one of the points in discussing the history of the libertarian movement is where did it all start? And the answer is it started with the ancient Hebrews and the ancient Greeks and the conflicts between church and state in the Western world. And all of those things have led us to where we are. And if you're in a country that didn't start even with that heritage, then you're in really bad shape. If you're in a European country, you have some of that heritage. And one of the things my colleague Tom Palmer always talks about is every country needs its own narrative of freedom. So in Iraq, he tells them about Gilgamesh. We all read Gilgamesh when we were in the 8th grade or something, but none of us understood really what it was about. Tom says it's a story about liberty and order. It's a story about standing up against a dictator and constraining him. In China, he shows them the ancient Chinese words of Lao Tzu, which are kind of libertarian. When my book, Libertarianism, a Primer, was translated into Mongolian, I said to Tom, what's the libertarian hook in Mongolia? And he came up with, during the era of Genghis Khan, there was ordered liberty across a wide area. A person could carry a purse full of gold across this whole area. Now, it's kind of because it was a police state, but it did allow, over this long space, trading. And trading is really important to human happiness. So, okay, at least we have this. There was protection for commerce and trade across a wide area, and that's a good thing. So, if you can find it in Genghis Khan, you can find a narrative of liberty in your country, and that's one of the things you can build on. Looks to me like maybe we're done here, so let me thank you all for being here, and hope you have a great summer.